As I'm sure all of you know, a new release by Antony Beevor is a very big publishing event. A former British officer, Antony is a military expert famed for a remarkable series of blockbuster books that exposes a great deal more than we knew about the conflicts of the 20th century. Major works include Stalingrad, Berlin, the downfall in 1945, D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, and the Battle for Spain, about the Spanish Civil War. Obviously an historian who works on a giant tapestry. But Antony Beevor not only excels at high strategy and describing how that evolved, but also shows an extraordinary eye for detail by uncovering overlooked foreign archives, combing diaries and personal letters. He reveals much that is astonishing, poignant, and often chilling about our human natures in war. Just to quote one British review on the Second World War, quote, "This is as comprehensive and objective an account of the course of the war as we are likely to get, and the most humanly moving to date." I'd like to introduce Antony Beevor. Great to see you again, Antony, and I want to start right in with the vastness of the canvas you work upon. I worked it out today, have been reading about the Second World War since I was 12, over half a century, yet I'm still struck and stunned by the amazing, it's shock and awe, its ability still to say, have you shaking your head and saying, how is that possible? Will we ever get out from under, historically, the shadow of this war, do you think?
To a certain degree, no. And I think one of the reasons for that, and this is one of the great dangers today, is that the Second World War has become the dominant reference point for every crisis and every conflict. And we've seen the dangers of that, whether it was going back to 1956, Eden comparing NASA to Suez, whether it was Kennedy, in fact, almost blackmailed into involvement in Vietnam because of his father's reputation as an appeaser. George Bush comparing 9/11 to Pearl Harbor, which of course implied immediately a strategy of state-on-state war rather than taking it as purely as a security problem. And then, you know, the Department of Defense and the neocons immediately assuming that shock and awe would create a totally subservient Iraqi populace, and comparing them, in fact, to the Germans and the Japanese in 1945. Well, there was going to be no comparison whatsoever. So there are huge dangers in this sort of dominant reference point, but at the same time, there is a lot still to learn and to be reminded. I mean, for example, when we see developments in Europe at the moment, as soon as we start to see threats against immigrants or xenophobia or whatever, those certainly should be warning signals flashing quite loudly as we see a certain disintegration of the centre in European politics at the moment due to these external pressures and, should we say, memories of the Great Depression and the 1930s.
It seems to the moral aspects of that war are going to fascinate, if not haunt us, almost forever. Two things come out, among many things, come out in this book that really struck me. It's almost a question of the innocent and the damned. One is the millions, the tens of millions of average people who got sucked up into that war and had their lives blighted or changed forever. Almost everybody here probably knows somebody who had that happen, or a family that went through it. The other is, and this really shocks me, we're talking not thousands, but millions who committed the most gross murders imaginable. The massacres all over Eastern Europe, in Asia, what have you. Start with the innocent first, and give us a sense of the impact that did cause so many people to basically get swept up in this war and never be the same quite again.
Well, I think one of the most striking aspects is the way that nobody really had any control over their own fate. And that's one of the reasons why I start the book with the story of this Korean who was forced at the age of 18 into the Japanese army in Manchuria, then was captured by the Russians at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, was then later forced into Red Army uniform, and was then later captured by the Germans and forced into German uniform, and he was finally captured by the Americans in Normandy in 1944. Came back to a British prison camp, was then moved to a prison camp in the United States, and at the end of the war he was released and settled in the United States and finally died in Illinois in 1992. It was the most extraordinary story, but in many ways it, for me, summed up the way that people did not have any control over their own fate, but also the global nature of the whole war, the way that it, in fact, interreacted. And one of the reasons, really, for writing the book was because I realized myself, having focused on certain subjects before, that I just did not know enough about the way the whole thing fitted together. And I think that's one of the vital aspects of that war.
Well, you brought in much more of the whole Asian war that we have tended to ignore quite a bit on this continent, and we'll get to that later. But that other element of humanity that leaves one shaken, and that is the cruelty, the viciousness of human beings one towards the other, in particular areas of the world, is just beyond our almost comprehension today. What explains the fact that Soviets and Germans could kill on mega scale?
Yes, and the Japanese too. What one has to understand is, and it really boils down to one thing, and that's the dehumanization of your enemy. Goebbels, with a diabolical genius, realized that hatred alone was not enough. You had to combine hatred with fear to get that really potent, killing mentality. I suppose I was first fascinated when working on the Spanish Civil War, and I realized that particularly in a sort of macho society like the Spanish society, that it was the suppression of fear which actually produced that completely unstable chemical reaction which exploded in such violence afterwards. So propaganda and the sort of the psychological preparation of soldiers to kill, and not just other soldiers but also civilians, was, I think, one of the most outstanding characteristics, the most appalling characteristic of the Second World War. But it was also true of the Japanese, when you have to remember that the average Japanese soldier came from a society which was conditioned to respect militarism. You know, the mothers stitched what were called 1,000-stitch scarves, which they gave to their sons before they were sent off to war, which they wrapped around themselves and somehow in a belief that it would ward off bullets. But once they got to training, then the sergeants, the corporals, would humiliate them completely, slap their faces, and generally beat them up. Now, this wasn't just to enforce conformity. It was above all a question of the knock-on theory of oppression, that it meant that they were going to humiliate and take out all of their take out and humiliate, sorry, I'd got the microphone in the wrong place, humiliate their enemies, both civilian and military. So you had a lot of programming in that particular way. In the case of the Soviet-German war, the Germans, of course, had been taught to see the Soviet soldiers and the Soviet civilians as sort of below human, subhuman, and all the rest of it, rather as the Japanese reviewed the Chinese. Ever since elementary school, they've been taught to believe in the divine race of the Japanese, and basically the fact that, well, not the fact, sorry, basically the idea that somehow the Chinese were below pigs. So, if you like, they were all psychologically prepared.
Knowing the full scale of the horrors, I wondered if when you were researching the war, you ever kept asking yourself, which I do every time I open a new book about the Second War, the question, could it really have been avoided in the 1930s? Was it the leaders or was it a lack of public will? Was there any way do you think around 1938, 39, this either the U.S. and Britain, France, be more combining with the Soviet Union some way, realistically, it could have been avoided, that war?
Well, the standard rule for historians is that nothing is inevitable, and I think that's absolutely true. But I would phrase it in another way. I think it's very hard to imagine how the war could have been avoided when Hitler was determined to have the war. So really, from the moment that he became Chancellor and was able to manipulate events so that he had complete control in Germany, I don't see how it could have been avoided. The real turning point, in a way, I suppose, was the very early spring of 1939, when Hitler occupied the remains of Czechoslovakia, because that indicated to the French and the British that in fact he was determined to go in for territorial expansion rather than just his claim of getting the Germans back in under one roof. So from that point on, I think that it was unthinkable that it could have been stopped. But even before then, when you have a leader with a very, very powerful and effective army, as Hitler was, with a determination to wreak war on the whole of Europe. And let's face it, remember, Hitler was furious that he'd been deprived of a war because, you know, the British and the French had caved in over Czechoslovakia at the Munich conference. I mean, he was really frustrated by that.
And understandably, given the First World War had happened only 18 years earlier, the Western public were horrified by
Yes.
imagine of standing up and going into another war yet again.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the French and the British were determined to avoid the war, and they assumed, this is always the mistake when you judge another country or another person, if you like, by your own feelings. They assumed that the Germans would also want to avoid war, and so that was why they believed that Sir Hitler might well back down, and that he was really only interested in the German minority populations in the fringe areas or on the near abroad of Germany at that particular stage.
You deal with an interesting detail that one of the reasons Hitler was in such a rush was he was convinced he was going to die early. One wonders if he had a better doctor and less indigestion. Maybe we might have been spared that. I mean, he was convinced he was going to die a young man, or not?
Yes, he was, but he also had such a form of sort of intense narcissism that he felt, you know, nobody else could achieve what he was going to achieve. And he told his generals, unfortunately none of them have actually left any record of what they thought when he told them that, you know, nobody else is capable of achieving what I will achieve, and I have got to do all of this. I'm 51 years old or whatever it was at the time when he said it. So that we must go to war now. I was always very, very disturbed, if you like, in a way, of the whole debate, you know, does evil exist? And I remember asking a very distinguished psychiatrist in Britain, who was also a passionate student of history, and I said, you know, tell me, I know you can't sort of obviously analyze somebody you've never really met or who's never been on your couch, but, you know, after all you've read about them and all the rest of it, how would you rate Stalin and how would you rate Hitler? And he said, well, with Stalin, I think it's fairly straightforward. I think one would probably classify him as a paranoid schizophrenic. But he said, when it comes to Hitler, I think all one can say is that he had a severe personality disorder. I felt I hadn't sort of quite solved any problems as far as that was concerned on hearing that.
We usually date the start of the Second World War, September the 1st, 1939, German invasion of Poland, the 3rd, Britain comes into the war. But your book brings out, in a way I haven't seen before, the degree to which major war was already occurring in Asia, involving not just Japanese and Chinese, but the Russians and the Japanese, a war which the Soviet Union and the Japanese, a war which we've heard very, very little still in the West.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, I think it underlines the fact also that every country has their own vision their own memory of the Second World War because of their experiences at the time. I mean, for the Americans, the war started in December 1941. For the Russians, it was June 1941. For most of Europe, it was September 1939, and also obviously for Canada, declaring war at that particular stage. For the Chinese, of course, it was 1937, or even 1931 if you include Japan's invasion of Manchuria. So all of these times really underlines the fact that the Second World War was actually a conglomeration of different conflicts, both state-on-state clash, major powers fighting each other, but also an element of the international civil war. But when one looks at, I start the book, in fact, in August 1939, and this is not just to be controversial or different or anything like that. I mean, I genuinely believe the way that the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, which was a major border conflict between the Japanese and the Russians in the Far East, it was on the border of Manchuria and Mongolia. Mongolia was more or less a Soviet protectorate, while Manchuria had been completely occupied by the Japanese. And the Japanese were being very, very provocative at the time, and there were many senior Japanese officers and generals whose real objective, they wanted to attack the Soviet Union. They were obsessed about Bolshevism, and they wanted to attack the Soviet Union, and they thought they could take a huge chunk out of Siberia and Vladivostok and all the rest of it. But by getting a very bloody nose at Khalkhin Gol, because General Zhukov in his first combat command inflicted a very heavy defeat. It was not a very big battle, but my God, it was an influential one, because it had the knock-on effect of persuading the Japanese that it was against their interest to attack north against Russia, and in fact they would do better to attack south later against the British, French, Dutch possessions, and of course the American bases around the Pacific. But it also had a huge knock-on effect on what was basically the geopolitical turning point of the war, i.e. the battle before Moscow, because although the Germans requested help that the Japanese should tie down the Russian divisions, particularly the Siberian divisions in the Far East, when they realized that the Japanese were not going to take part in that particular fighting, but they were going to attack south against the Americans, then Stalin was able to bring in all those Siberian divisions at that really crucial moment. And I really do think December 1941, as many historians have rightly argued, was the geopolitical turning point of the war.
So many of these events hang on this thread, like a battle few people have perhaps even heard of here. Dissuades the Japanese from, as you say, stabbing the Soviet Union in the back when Hitler invades, would have changed the whole course of the world. Go south instead, changed the whole history of the Pacific. Turning back to the West again, I wanted to ask you about the big drama we all know about, Dunkirk, the threatened invasion of Britain. How serious do you think was Hitler in actually wanting to invade Britain? That tends to be still debated to some extent.
Well, I think that Hitler had a fairly open mind. I think he was actually rather realistic in this particular case. Curiously, those who were most obsessed with the invasion of Britain was the SS, and particularly the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, who'd even compiled lists of all the British who should be rounded up and arrested and all the rest of it.
2000, I believe.
Yes, something like that. Yes, well, of course, it was a badge of honor to be on that list. I think anybody who wasn't was deeply offended. But as far as the Wehrmacht was concerned, their position was quite straightforward. The Royal Navy was still incredibly powerful, and unless they could establish air supremacy, or certainly at least air superiority over the Channel, and unless the Luftwaffe could achieve that, then as far as they were concerned, there was no question of attempting that cross-channel invasion. So that's why the Battle of Britain was not just symbolic, but it was also important. But one mustn't overlook the fact that, of course, at the end of May, we have one of the first turning points of the war, and this was the only moment, really, when Hitler could have won the war, when Churchill stood up to Halifax. One has to remember how vulnerable Churchill was. He was Prime Minister. He'd only been Prime Minister since the 10th of May, and i.e. only about 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks. And he was hated by much of the Conservative Party. He did not have the support in the House of Commons. was, thank God, very clever, but maybe it was also genuine as well, so I mustn't be too cynical, in the way that he'd been very respectful to Chamberlain, even though Chamberlain had been humiliated by the exit. Churchill showed him every respect, insisted that he stayed in the official residence in number 10 Downing Street, and Churchill, would just take up lodgings in the Admiralty and so forth. So Chamberlain was there to support him when it came to the key debate. If Britain was to see what terms Hitler would demand in the case of negotiations. And Halifax thought, we're mad not to, because we could get good terms now. But if we lose the whole of the army in France, and this was the point where the Navy estimated they could only probably get off about 20,000 of the troops in Dunkirk, nobody expected the miracle to happen. It was, as we say, hanging by a thread in a way. And that's the one moment when Hitler could have won the war, because if he'd managed to force Britain into a completely subservient position through negotiation, the handing over of the fleet, and basically disarming Britain, even if he hadn't actually occupied it fully, then there would have been very little chance of the liberation of Europe with, American, Canadian troops and so forth coming to Britain to reinvade the continent.
The one interesting option discussed was the British fleet sailing, leaving Britain and moving to Canada.
Well, that was one of Churchill's major mistakes psychologically, and I think he realized it very soon after he sent that message to Roosevelt. I mean, he sent this message to Roosevelt basically trying to convince him of how desperate the situation was. And in fact, it had a contrary effect. Roosevelt read it as Churchill vacillating and even considering the possibility of surrender, which was totally the opposite of what Churchill wanted to do. And this, of course, led to one of the great tragedies of the war, because it pushed Churchill into ordering Admiral Somerville's attack on the French fleet at Mas el-Kabir, because this was the one way that Churchill had to signal to the world that Britain was ruthless, that Britain was going to fight to the end, whatever it took. The French were given the option of sailing to the New World, to America, the United States, or even to French possessions in the West Indies, in the Antilles, but the admiral refused, and that was when the much of the fleet, or part of the fleet, was sunk.